morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and in love. Good morning, sun. Good morning, sun. Good morning, life. Good morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and in love. Good morning, sun.
And good morning to you. Raise a glass of coffee. So I was going to talk about a Business Central API topic, but there were other things in there, and so I think I'll defer that one. And just this is the random topic session of stuff I've been working on that I think it's kind of interesting. And let's just check audio. Okay, sounds like we are sounding good. So welcome. Let's jump into this. Lots of random stuff here. So you may have heard that the United States had a bit of a cold spell the last week or two. And I don't really follow the news too much. But then I heard that primarily Texas, it was affecting other states, but primarily Texas. And a few people that I follow on Twitter, Reza Durrani being one, had no power, and because of the cold temperatures, and the most Texas homes and the construction and building styles in Texas are not well suited to sub-freezing temperatures. The pipes froze, so he was without water and without power. So that produces a pretty problematic cycle where you can't warm the home to defrost the pipes, and then once the pipes start bursting, you have all sorts of problems. So I live in Los Angeles, so the threat of sub-freezing temperatures is not significant where I live. But I just happen to live in a city that used a particular type of infrastructure for power distribution. And that lower voltage was, whatever it is, say it's a 3,000 volt or whatever that type of system was that they implemented and the transformers they used, it meant that the electrical quality, the quality of the electricity in my particular neighborhood was not great. And I happen to live at the end of the street. So the way it worked was there's a transformer kind of in the center of the neighborhood, and as you travel farther away from that transformer, the voltage will gradually drop as each house pulls a little bit of electricity from the power lines. I was like next to the last house on the block. So I was at the very end of that distribution chain. As a result, my voltage, like say nominal 120 volts, my voltage would be 108 volts. Our microwave barely worked. My UPSs were complaining. They were saying, hey, you have an undervolt situation here. And as a result of that, and a car hit a power pole, and there was a big San Diego power outage, I think in 2011 or 2014, something like that. And that affected the entire Southwest region. I think it was like New Mexico, Arizona, California, and northern Mexico. As a result of that, I got a generator, and it seemed kind of crazy at the time, but I've actually used it for several days, primarily when the power company's done maintenance. And every once in a while, you get a reminder, like the Texas situation, that the power goes out. And I work from home. I have a home office. I've been doing this for over a decade. So for me, this is my office power. This is my office backup power. If I went to work every day at an office, then this wouldn't be as critical. But I have invested in these generators and can now comfortably run my entire house on these generators for a couple weeks. They're very efficient. So just a couple of gas cans and yeah, I can run for a couple weeks. So it was a good reminder. And if now that a lot of people are working from home, working remotely, you can buy the like the Harbor Freight version of these. They've done a pretty nice knockoff of the Honda generators, and they're like $500. And so it's not a bad investment to have. You don't have to get as fancy as what I've done with a transfer switch and tandem generators, but you could just have one with extension cords that give you some essential power. And so I'm able to run all of my computers, my office, my internet, refrigerator without problem. So it's not something I expect to use regularly, but it is kind of handy. So random topic number 1. On to number 2. So this, I don't know how I learned about this, but this is called Handshake, or it's also called HNS, which I think refers to Handshake Name System or Handshake Naming System. I'm not entirely sure, but Handshake or HNS is, my simplified interpretation, is an attempt to create a distributed I don't know if there's a blockchain behind it, but essentially a distributed, decentralized version of DNS. And several reasons for this: DNS issues, the highly centralized nature of DNS, the ICANN naming system where it's a centralized body that issues these, or at the national level or nation level, you have TLDs like .com or say .uk that restrict or control the access to those domain names. So this is kind of an attempt to have a different version of the top level domain naming system and DNS, is my understanding. And there are several different philosophical ways to be interested in this. But one that I just happened to see recently is a company that I use for online backups, a very large, prominent company. They have had 2 DNS outages over the last month that have taken one of their services completely offline. The first one, they didn't really explain what it was, I don't think, but it sounded like a technical issue. So it took them days on the phone with GoDaddy to get that resolved. And then they have to wait for propagation, of course. So it was quite a mess that they were dealing with. The second one turned out that someone apparently filed like a copyright claim or a takedown notice on something that a user had backed up, from what I could tell. And somehow someone was able to find a URL that pointed to that content and issued a takedown notice or a warning of some, I don't know what the protocol is for DNS violations, but they issued this takedown notice, and apparently the protocol is they go to the DNS registrar and they blacklist you from the DNS system. So this company's DNS infrastructure was taken down due to some type of, I think, a copyright notice. And they were given the notice. They were aware of it. They took down the offending content or offending URL, whatever that was. Despite that, 24, 48 hours later, this agency or whoever filed the claim went to the registrar, took down their entire domain, and shut down much of their infrastructure in North America. So, I mean, I understand, there's legal rights and all that involved, but it was a pretty bad situation for them. Even though they had complied, someone still took down their entire business for a couple of days. So that's just one example of what this potentially is trying to work towards, as well as kind of the monopoly on the registrar system. So this was an interesting learning process. I went to a company called Namebase, or organization called Namebase. I had to buy these HNS tokens. I don't know what, I don't even remember what they're called. And so you have to buy these tokens, almost like a cryptocurrency token. And then you can bid on names, and it's roughly a 2-week process to buy your HNS TLD, or top level domain. So I bought one called Steve Endo. And so now that I own this HNS name, I can eventually, it in theory will be supported by browsers and a decentralized DNS system. And for now, there is a pointer system called dlinks hosted at hns.to, and there's also a DNS server you can add to your DNS infrastructure. But right now, the experiment is for dlinks is you go to steveendo.hns.to, and that is an HNS fully decentralized DNS name. From there, I can post my traditional DNS links, so Twitter, YouTube, blog, website, etc. So it's an interesting experiment. I'm curious to see where it goes. As we know, DNS is pretty fragile. Lots of outages due to DNS problems. Azure and Microsoft have been plagued by them. So that's the old joke on Twitter. It's always DNS, right? You could have $1 billion in infrastructure, and someone screws up DNS and it takes down your entire, it makes all of your infrastructure inaccessible, no matter how much redundancy you have in place. So it is a fragile and problematic system. So I don't know that this is going to solve all that, but it potentially solves some interesting problems. Okay. A random thing that I saw on Twitter is this service called Replit. And I haven't researched the history of it and where it's going, but I find it fascinating. As a test, so my acid test for these new types of in-browser or online IDEs is, can I turn on my iPad, pull up a web browser, and let me just mute my phone for 1 second. Okay, mute all devices. Can I pull up a web browser on my iPad and type in this URL and have a development environment? And with Replit, I was instantly able to create an account and say, I want to create a new Python project. And because I'm curious about Python, I don't really have the time to learn yet another language, but I have the superpower of procrastination. So rather than doing actual work that I need to do, learning Python and figuring out how to do that with a very low cost or low effort IDE is intriguing to me. So I was able to pull this up, and lots of languages. It says over 50 languages are supported. And the appeal is no environment. I don't have to set up a development environment. I don't need Windows. I don't need a install, say, the Python engine. I don't need to install VS Code, although that's free and relatively easy. I don't need to install extensions. So I was watching a Microsoft series of Python for beginners. It's a 44 video series. It's like the first 4 videos, they're short videos, but it's like the first 4 videos were solely dedicated to trying to explain how to set up a development environment, download this, install that, configure that, get this set up before you can even write the first line of code. And this will be a theme I carry over. And so here, no environment, no install, no IDE, no plugins, no extension, no runtime engines. I just opened a browser, went to Replit, said I want to code Python, and boom, I am up and running. From what I could tell, one of the initial motivations for this, and this apparently is a venture-backed, funded effort, Replit, was education and getting people into the coding space. And now it has become popular enough where organizations are able to develop solutions, or at least prototypes, proof of concept, essentially fully vetted prototypes and working concepts in Replit. So if your tendency is to discount this, as, oh, you could never do a complex project and, a large code base. And I would be, I would rethink that. This is a fully source controlled environment, fully collaborative. So I could have 5 people coding with me, do code reviews. Great for educational environment, also for team coding. All of this could be done in a browser on any device, mobilely. It doesn't matter. So the barrier to entry for development is just constantly dropping. So now with a browser on an iPad, I could have a collaborative call with a colleague and be online with them, reviewing code, writing code, and making things happen. And it isn't just Python. My understanding is that it is full web frameworks. So you could have a full-on web application developed and hosted via Replit. You could have it in a Git repository. You could have CI/CD publishing it to whatever platform you want, whether that's Azure Web Services, Azure Functions, you name it. So really powerful. So it's something I'm very interested in. I've been wanting to develop in a browser, on an iPad, or even an iPad app for years now. And I just saw that they have a mobile app, so I'm going to check that out as well. If I can use this in a browser on an iPad or in an app on an iPad, I'd love to. Now, obviously, in the context of Business Central and AL, which is typically who my audience here, unlikely to happen anytime soon for lots of reasons. But don't discount this. This is a competitor to all of the traditional IDE, traditional development environment. This is a zero cost, zero hassle, zero effort, immediate coding environment. So very cool stuff. Where is PowerPoint? Okay. Good question from Sean Dorward, fellow MVP on Twitter. If you don't follow him at lifehacks365.com. He talks about Business Central and I think Power Platform and lots of other stuff, and he will be presenting at DynamicsCon as well. So he asks, how do you get the web camera to be at eye level? And he talks about drilling the hole in the middle of his monitor. And so I think there's 2 questions here. He talks about the camera being at eye level, but drilling the hole in the middle of the monitor makes me think that he's more referring to how can I look at my screen and also look directly at my camera. So I'm looking at my monitor 1, I'm looking at my monitor 3, my PowerPoint, and you can tell I am not looking at the camera. So it's more, I think the question which I've been challenged with as well is looking at the camera while being able to see what I'm presenting or what I'm demoing. And you can't, right? The camera's here, the monitor's here, or somewhere else, and you can't really look at it. So I posted a photo of my setup here. So you can see that I have 4 monitors, and I've had to do this totally wonky thing. I tried a bunch of things. I tried putting a tripod, a small tripod on my desk, sitting in front of my monitor so that it would be, I'd be looking at my monitor and I'd be either the left or the right, and the camera would be right in the center. It's a nightmare. The tripod's in the way, the camera's in the way. I'm doing this, looking at the edges of my monitor, so I gave up. So I ended up mounting the monitor on my monitor stand at the back of my desk with a swivel arm, and it's fixed there. So I can choose to look at my camera, I can choose to look at my presentation, and I can point to it because I know where it's at on the green screen. So no good solution. But Art, who I believe does a lot of AV stuff, he had a good point. And he kind of homed in on I think Sean's fundamental question is, I want to see my content and look at my camera at the same time. And so Art's, I think, on point here is he uses a teleprompter with a reflected screen. That way you're always looking at the screen and the camera at the same time. You may be looking a little left, a little right, but if your camera's far enough away, the eye movement will be imperceptible. The problem I found with that, I tried that with a homemade teleprompter. One is real professional teleprompters are usually pretty expensive. You can buy the small iPad ones or small ones for several $100s. But to get a larger one that you can see at a distance, they're pretty expensive because that mirrored glass, that special coated glass, is quite expensive. I tried a DIY version and it just doesn't work out well. So it's a lot of hassle. They're big, they're bulky. It's going to be sitting in front of you. It's not something you can easily put up and take down efficiently. So it requires a fair amount of investment. So for now, I don't worry about it. I look at the camera, I read the slide, I look at the camera, I do my demo, and it's good enough. And so I'm over that personally, but yeah, it would be great if it was easier. Next up, Pi-hole. So I learned about this several years ago because I hate ads and banners and annoying junk, and I've tried ad blockers, but then there's ad blocker blockers. So if you go to a website, they won't let you see the content because they detect the ad blockers. So it's an escalating war. And one of the key motivators for me was when ad services and ad streams of varying quality were hijacked to deliver malware. And so even prominent sites like New York Times were using ad services that either through lack of vetting or compromised feeds were injecting malware and browser crypto mining and crazy things like this into the ad feed that was being displayed to viewers. So I said, nope, enough of that. And when ad blockers were starting to be blocked, I found Pi-hole, which stepped it up. And Pi-hole is blocking tens of thousands of DNS requests. And basically, to back up, Pi-hole is a DNS server that you can run. So it's just a lightweight DNS server that you can run on your network, and it has block lists. So you can download these block lists. It comes with a few. You can download others from various people, and it will block things like doubleclick.net or various well-known ad services. And it also blocks malware. So you can have a crypto mining block list. You can have a malware block list. You can have a foreign website block list, whatever. And so I'm blocking thousands of, let me see if I can pull it up here. So here we go. Let me pull this in. So I am, as of whatever this period is, I'm blocking 18,000 queries out of 81,000, 22% blocked, and I currently maintain block lists blocking over 700,000 domains, and that includes wildcards like ads.email. And so lots of things are being blocked. And as a result, I'm seeing just no ads. It works very, very well. It does block some things that will cause a website to not work properly. So sometimes I have to go in here and allow certain domains or certain regular expressions in order to get things to work. But really fantastic. And I run my internal one on a Raspberry Pi. I had a Raspberry Pi from a prior failed project. It was just sitting in a box. So I figured out, okay, how do you get this thing to work? And I know nothing about Raspberry Pis, but they have step-by-step instructions. I imaged it, downloaded some OS specific for the Pi-hole. Super simple once you get through it. And then, once a month I'll update it via SSH. And you can also run it on Docker. So you might be able to run, if you have a Docker machine, you can run it there. You'll obviously want something that's on 24/7. You could run it on a Synology. I believe that runs Docker. But I think Raspberry Pi is the easiest because it's such a small, low power, innocuous device. You just stick it in a corner on a bookshelf and you don't even notice it. Sit it next to your router. So it supports various flavors of various OSs. So really neat solution for blocking ads and improving the security of your network. And you can also add block lists. So if there were websites that were suspicious or potentially problematic, I can just block those so nothing in my house, IoT, my family can access those sites. Okay. I asked a question a while back. I was trying to I did a presentation on BC, and I was trying to explain how do you describe Business Central's programming language, so AL, and the code that Business Central is written in. Is it because you can view the source code of most Business Central pages and tables and extensions, and you can download that code or make it accessible from a Docker container. It's not locked down or compiled. So how do you describe that? Is that open source? It's viewable code. And so I didn't know of the word or the phrase to describe what that is. And so I asked, is that open source? And Eric Hugard did a video answering my question in far more detail. And I knew it probably wasn't open source in the Linux sense or the free open source FOSS sense. But you can contribute issues to GitHub, and there's conversations about bugs in the source. So Eric does a much more comprehensive overview of what the AL language is. And it's not open source, but it is viewable, it's accessible, and you can look at things and find bugs or see why your code isn't interacting with it properly. So check out his video, and if you're not subscribed to his YouTube channel, he does tons of great videos answering questions like this and providing demos. Okay, so the journey of learning. Learning is difficult, and the last year plus I've been learning Business Central and all the ancillary things required to learn Business Central and Business Central development. And two things. So a while ago I said one of the challenges of learning is learning doesn't scale. It's very time consuming, and so it requires your body and your mind, and it just takes time. So I can't learn like 2 times faster. I can't necessarily just speed up the YouTube videos and consume the content faster. I can do that, but I won't necessarily learn any faster. I need to go through the process. I need to make mistakes. I need to do the exercises and have it sink into my slow brain. So I can only devote so much time to learning new things. And so I'm time constrained based on, my available time and my body and my attention span and not being tired and all those other things. And similarly, curiosity doesn't scale well. I can be curious about 1 or 2 or 5 things. I can't be curious about 50 things and pursue that curiosity, right? I would get nothing done and accomplish nothing because I'd be spreading my brain across those 50 things. So the other challenge I'm finding, just the other day, I wanted to look into something, and I said, okay, let me look into this, topic A. Oh, well, in order to answer or learn about topic A, I need to understand B and need to go set that up in Business Central. Oh, well, in order to do that, I need to understand how C works because B relies upon C. Okay, I'm doing C. Well, if I'm going all this effort of A, B, C, I need to set up this environment D to hold all that configuration. Okay, so now I'm working with A, B, C, and D, and I've got all this effort. Well, how do I maintain that environment or reproduce that environment? Because I don't want to do all this work and have it blown away when my Docker container dies. Oh, well, you might need to automate that. And that requires an entirely different layer of understanding E to automate that. It's like, oh, gosh. So, I just want to answer A, but that requires B, C, D, and E in order to really fully support the effort to learn about A. So it is a rabbit hole, and you just go down it, and it's expensive. So the ABCDE conversation started with this post, which I'll make a separate video on because it is kind of involved and goes through all of those things in Business Central and got to know a lot of detail. So that's probably an hour conversation on its own. But interesting question that was posed from the forum. And I'm going to try to answer more forum posts because when I actually understand what they're asking, it's words I recognize, some really interesting questions here. So this is about, I want to submit a record to the Business Central API, and I want to use item templates, and I want to do that in order to default some values with my items, including the number series. So if I create an item for this type of item, I want that item to have this number series. If I want to create a different type of item, I want to use a different number series. And this person, Lillian, noticed all my other fields and settings from the item template are applied to my new item based on, item type A or item type B, except for number series. And like, why isn't that working? So I spent a few hours trying to figure out what's going on here. I replicated it, looked into the code, and confirmed, yeah, it doesn't work. And I think I understand why. I don't know if it's a great reason, but I at least think I see in the code why it's doing what it's doing. So that was a very interesting journey, and it all started with a forum post. And I had to figure out, okay, what are templates? Configuration templates. So I set up some item templates, learned about how to do that. And then I had to go to API setup and figure out, okay, when I submit via API, there's this feature where based on certain parameters of the submitted record, it can apply one of those templates, be it item or customers or vendors or resources, whatever. So that's a pretty cool feature that I'll cover in a later video. So I had to go so deep that I almost got lost, and the naming of the things in Business Central is foreign to me and not the clearest in the world for someone who's new to it. It's like, wait a minute, template, configuration template, API setup. So these terms were new and it was very confusing. So just to answer a seemingly simple question, here's why. I had to go down a very long journey. And this was just understanding the dependencies within Business Central. And that last step, E, is how do I reproduce this environment? Had me ask the question, okay, so I've gone all this effort to configure this scenario to test what happens when you import a record via the API and how templates are applied. I want to save this environment, my container. I want to snapshot this container because I want to set it off to the side and be able to reproduce this without having to reset this up, without having to write, automated test data fixtures to reproduce this every single time. I just want to have this Docker container sitting off to the side to demonstrate this one scenario. So I said, is it possible to make a copy of this container? I want to clone it. I want to give it a new name and just have it off to the side. So I have my dev17 container. It gets wiped and rebuilt every morning. If I set up all this, put all this work into that container, it's gone tomorrow. So how do I make a copy of this? And I looked into this. It wasn't obvious how to do this. People said, oh, you do this and this. I'm like, oh, there's Docker commands. And I was like, whoa, I don't understand that. So I got this reply from unofficial Business Central support, kind of a semi-parody account, but the person running it obviously knows what they're doing with Nav and Business Central. And Nav Container Helper or BC Container Helper apparently has a command where you can back up the databases. So this is one option. So you have your container. Rather than trying to clone Docker and dealing with Docker containers, one option is you back up the Business Central databases, which captures all the configuration and setup data that I wanted to. And then whenever you want to restore that configuration to a container, you can. So it doesn't matter what container it is. I just restore the databases into that container. Voila, I have my configuration in place. Now, it needs to be the same build and version of Business Central. So that makes sense. So that is option one. But then Stefan saw my tweet as well, and he thought, aha, he had had the same question before, but hadn't really dug into it. Excuse me, coffee break. And so he looked into it, and he found the same command I did, but I didn't understand it. So he says, okay, you just stop your container, you do what's called a commit, and apparently that takes your container and it commits it, I guess the image and your container, it merges those two and commits it to a new container image, a new image that you specify. So you have an image you're running on, your BC image, you have your BC container, you kind of merge them into a new image that you can then spool up as a new container at any point. So in his example, Docker commit, in my case, my container would be dev17, and then my resulting image that I want to have created that stores this configuration, he's saying backup : container to copy. And apparently the backup : I'm not familiar with, that's kind of like a subfolder structure. I'll have to look into that. And he's saying that if you have Docker extension for VS Code, that colon will be recognized as a subfolder. So it'd be go in your backup subfolder in your VS Code view of your Docker containers or images. So this is another way to do it. And this captures the entire Docker infrastructure in an image. So it is perhaps more convenient in some ways than backing up the databases. So I'm going to try that as well. Okay. So let's see. So Karsten asks on the chat, does this work after a Windows update? That is a good question. Yeah, it may or may not. So for instance, if you have this Docker image, it may be tied to that Windows version, the Windows version when it was committed. And if you get a new Windows update in 6 months, can you still create a container based on that image? And that's an excellent question. It may fail to work because as those of us who have played with Docker know, at least the BC container images tend to be very Windows OS version dependent. So yeah, that's a good point. So that may be a case for also doing the backup. So short term, this commit and having an image may work, but longer term, you may need to go with the backup. But even the backup is version dependent on your Business Central version of that image. So yeah, it's a good point. In which case the automated test fixtures in theory would be the least version dependent, but they require the most work. So yeah, for longevity, good question. I'll have to test that. Excellent point. Okay, so using Git for everything. So I have a Windows server that runs Docker Enterprise Edition, and that's what I use for my central office business development. I don't do it on my workstation because it's messy. I have all my applications installed there. So I want a clean, and Waldo points out, it might not work after a Windows update. Yeah, so that's your risk there. So I like to have a clean, stable Windows server for my development. I don't install a bunch of apps. I don't install games. It's just for that, and it keeps it really stable. So I can run I've done this with virtual machines. My virtual machines can last for 10 years just fine, perfectly stable. So my Docker server is stable, but when I'm remote, I'm on my laptop and I can VPN in and RDP to that server. I've done that for over a decade, works perfectly fine. But what's new to Business Central for me, it's new to me working with Business Central, I can have Docker running on my laptop. So my Windows 10 laptop, I can use Docker Desktop Edition, which obviously has its quirks and eccentricities, shall we say. But if I want to run a Docker container on my laptop, I can, and be fully disconnected as long as that's current and I have Visual Studio and all my code. And I can just clone a repo to my laptop. Well, the challenge is if I want to clone, that means my Git repo has to be current. So if I'm playing with code on my server, I need to make sure that it is checked in so I can bring it down. Well, I haven't been doing that for my just testing and learning projects because it takes time and I got to remember to do it and it's a hassle, right? And I'm lazy and I don't like Git for various reasons. So I said I was going to force myself to try and do this. So okay, rather than just opening Visual Studio, starting the code and play around, I need to back up, create a Azure DevOps repo, I think they call it, project, whatever. The project has repositories, need to set that up. I need to clone that or set that up on my server, and then I can start writing code. And it's kind of like one of those things, you got to brush your teeth, you got to floss every day, you got to eat healthy. It's like, okay, it's just one of those things I got to learn to do. So I am forcing myself, and I use the term force because it's not something I want to do. It's not something that really adds to my immediate productivity in getting to that point. It's just one more thing that's between me and trying to learn this one little snippet of code. and it just in case I want to use it on my laptop in a month or a week or whatever. So I'm sure it'll get faster and only take me 2 minutes, 5 minutes to do, but Azure DevOps, currently I'm using the web interface, and that might be part of my problem. I'm going to devazure.com, logging in, setting up my project, and it's just, I'm very slow with it. So maybe I need to look into how do I script this, because I've heard from a podcast that everything in Azure has an API. So maybe I PowerShell this. It creates my repo, my project, my repo, and clones it all in one step. And instead of taking me 10 minutes to figure this out, I can get it down to 30 seconds, just like my BC containers are now created every morning with zero effort on my part. So anyway, and this is an example of why it's like I made one mistake. Yes, it was a stupid mistake, but I did one thing out of sequence, and it's like, no, couldn't find remote ref master. I'm like, what is, like, I know what it's referring to, and I quickly know, it's like, oh, okay, I know what I did wrong. It's like, duh. But I forgot a step. It's like, come on. So these are all things that I just like to complain about because I just want to learn how to code. And this is just 5 more steps that I need to do that are between me and my code. And in this case, they're adding very little value, right? Because these are just learning experiments, and I'm not making money off of this. And that's where the conversation about Replit comes in. I just want to pull up a browser right now, write some code, prototype, learn. And all of this stuff is infrastructure that just stands in my way. It has value in some cases. In this case, like, oh, it's hard to justify. So Replit, I just yearn for a Replit environment. Bang, write some code. That's why this isn't working, or that's how I do this. And that's what I'm looking for. So I want to lower all that infrastructure cost as low as possible. So that is the potpourri, the random musings of my brain over the last couple of weeks. And yeah, so I hope that was interesting. And that's how my brain goes. So have a good day, and I will talk to you later.